If you stay, you might just save a life. I whispered to myself as I pushed open the heavy doors of the empty stadium, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off concrete like a warning. The lights overhead flickered faintly, casting long shadows across rows of abandoned seats, the remnants of yesterday's chaos still clinging to the air, crumpled programs, a stray jersey, and the lingering scent of sweat and popcorn. My hands were damp from the mop bucket I dragged behind me, but I couldn't stop scanning the dark corners beneath the stands, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. That's when I saw him, a figure lying half hidden by the shadows, motionless but for the slow rise and fall of his chest, a crimson stain marking his tailored jacket, an aura of authority muted by vulnerability. Lucas Donovan. I had heard the name whispered in the city like a warning, his presence a storm even when absent, and now he was here, under the stands, bleeding and entirely exposed. My pulse surged, a drum of fear and disbelief, but my instincts pushed me forward. I knelt beside him, careful not to touch anything that might worsen the situation, my fingers trembling as I grabbed my small first aid kit from the backpack, slung across my shoulder. Every step closer, the stadium's silence pressed against my ears, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the sense that someone, or something, was watching, waiting. Lucas's head turned slowly toward me, dark eyes narrowing, a flicker of recognition and authority shining through despite the pain, and he raised a hand just enough to acknowledge me, commanding yet restrained, a silent trust placed in my care. I tore a strip from my sweater, wrapping it with precise motions over the wound, the scent of antiseptic sharp in my nose, every heartbeat loud in my chest. The lights overhead buzzed softly, the hum filling the pause between my careful movements and his shallow breathing. A sudden echo of footsteps far above made me freeze, tension snapping like a taut wire. But Lucas shifted, ever composed even in weakness, his eyes locking with mine, grounding me in the storm of my fear. I adjusted the bandage, securing it without hesitation, whispering reassurances to him, though I doubted he could hear them, my voice carrying only to my own ears. And then, the faint scrape of metal from the upper decks, a sound that could have meant danger, made me glance up, muscles tensing, while his hand found mine, firm and possessive in a way that demanded focus, a silent promise of safety and ownership all at once. My breath caught, adrenaline mingling with the quiet intensity of his gaze, the stadium empty around us but charged with the memory of the crowd and the echo of potential threats. Every second stretched, a delicate balance between action and observation, the unspoken acknowledgement that the line between fear and trust had just been crossed. Lucas's grip tightened ever so slightly, not painful, but enough to anchor me, and I realized, in that instant, that the choice I had made, to stay, to help, to be present, had changed everything. The empty seats, the dim lighting, the cold concrete, all faded into the background as the connection between us crystallized, an unspoken understanding that in saving him, I had become an indelible part of his world, and nothing about this night would ever be the same. Emily Carter dragged the mop across the slick floor, the echoes of water dripping from the high beams filling the cavernous stadium, her ears straining for the faintest sound beyond her own breath, and each time she glanced toward Lucas Donovan, she felt a pull of both fear and responsibility. He shifted slightly, wincing, and she could see the tension in his posture even as he tried to mask the discomfort with his usual composure, the tailored suit still impeccably pressed despite the situation. Her fingers worked quickly, adjusting the bandage, checking the edges for proper coverage, and she noted how his breathing seemed to settle. Each inhalation and exhalation a slow rhythm she could almost synchronize with her own heartbeat. The stadium lights buzzed overhead, casting intermittent shadows that flickered across his sharp features, the intensity of his gaze unwavering as it followed her movements, and she realized that he was studying her as much as she was caring for him. Emily could feel the chill in the concrete under her knees, the scent of antiseptic mingling with the lingering odor of old popcorn and sports equipment, and every instinct told her to keep moving, to keep assessing, to remain vigilant. Lucas lifted his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that directed her attention, and she bent lower, her eyes scanning for any signs of further risk, her mind racing through every first aid procedure she had ever memorized, cataloging steps and making adjustments on the fly. There was a quiet authority in the way he moved his hand, a silent communication that told her she was doing the right thing, yet reminded her that the power in this scenario was not entirely hers. The distant echo of footsteps reverberated through the empty halls above, and Emily tensed, recognizing that they might not be alone, that the environment was still unpredictable. But Lucas remained calm, his presence a stabilizing force, grounding her despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She adjusted the strip of cloth one more time, pressed it firmly against the wound, and looked up to meet his stormy eyes, finding a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent approval that encouraged her to continue. Her fingers were steady now, despite the tremor in her chest, and she felt a measure of control returning as she prepared a makeshift sling to support his arm, careful to maintain his comfort while keeping him stable. The vastness of the stadium, the rows of empty seats, the scattered debris from the previous match, all seemed to fade into the background as the focus narrowed to the interaction between them, the silent communication passing in glances and gestures. Lucas tilted his head slightly, a subtle cue for her to adjust her position, and she obeyed without hesitation, the trust implicit in the act binding them in a fragile but undeniable connection. The lights above continued to hum, a constant reminder of the emptiness around them. Yet within that space, a bubble of intense focus formed, where danger, care, and the unspoken understanding of their roles converged. Emily could feel her own pulse slowing, synchronizing with the quiet rhythm of his chest, each beat a reminder that her actions mattered, that the attention to detail, the calm under pressure, and the deliberate movements were all making a difference. And as she finally stepped back slightly, hands still poised to react, she realized that the night had shifted irrevocably, that this shared experience under the stadium lights had created a bond neither of them could ignore, and that the balance between vulnerability and authority was now delicately maintained, held together by trust, focus, and the quiet courage to act in the face of uncertainty. Emily Carter carefully helped Lucas Donovan to a more comfortable position, her hands steady as she adjusted the makeshift sling beneath his arm, the fluorescent lights above casting a cold glow over the empty stadium and reflecting off the polished concrete floor. She could feel the quiet rhythm of his breathing syncing with the movement of her hands, a subtle reassurance that her efforts were working, and every small adjustment she made seemed to draw a faint nod from him, a silent acknowledgement of her competence. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust, the remnants of concession stands and worn upholstery carrying the faint memory of cheering crowds. But the focus narrowed entirely to the man in front of her, each detail of his posture, his expression, and the tension in his shoulders providing clues she instinctively read and responded to. A soft creak of the stadium stairs above made her pause, head tilting to catch the sound, and Lucas's eyes flicked briefly upward, the smallest sign that he was aware of every surrounding sound, his presence commanding even in vulnerability. Emily tightened her grip on the sling strap, adjusting it with precision, and in that careful motion, she felt the weight of responsibility settle over her, the knowledge that each small action was keeping him stable and alert. He shifted again, not speaking but moving slightly to indicate a need, and she responded instantly, her mind racing through every procedural step she had learned in training, cataloging them quietly to ensure she did not miss anything. The stadium felt endless, the empty seats stretching away into darkness, yet within this space, a bubble of intense focus enclosed them, a private world where the outside ceased to exist, and the only reality was the shared attention between them. She could see the tension in his jaw relax slightly as she smoothed the sling into place, and the faintest exhale from him suggested that comfort, however minor, was reaching through. The echo of her own movements against the floor tiles, the soft scrape of the mop bucket she had left near the concession area, and the distant hum of the overhead lights created a rhythm that mirrored the calm she was striving to instill, a backdrop for a delicate balance of trust and focus. Lucas's gaze never left hers, stormy yet steady, and Emily found herself responding not just to his silent cues, but to the unspoken agreement forming between them, a mutual recognition that she was the anchor in this moment, and he would remain still and cooperative as long as she directed the care. Every breath she took was measured, each glance calculated to reassure him without disturbing his balance. And as she adjusted the sling one final time, she noticed a flicker of a smile, subtle and fleeting, hinting at gratitude beneath the composed exterior. The stadium around them remained silent, a vast shell of cheering memories. But the energy between Emily and Lucas was alive, charged with the quiet electricity of two people connected in an extraordinary circumstance. She stepped back slightly, observing the results of her efforts, noting that his posture was less rigid, breathing steadier, and the small nod of his head conveyed an acknowledgement that transcended words. And in that moment, the empty stadium no longer felt desolate, but rather a space where focus, care, and subtle communication created an environment where trust could flourish. And Emily understood with clarity that the night had shifted, the dynamic between them now defined by shared effort, unspoken understanding, and a cautious but undeniable bond forming under the stark glow of the stadium lights. The silence of the stadium pressed around Emily Carter like a weight as she shifted slightly to fetch another clean towel from her backpack, the distant echo of the ceiling fans, humming through the vast emptiness and mingling with the subtle sound of her own breathing. Lucas Donovan remained partially propped against the concrete support. The tension in his posture softened only slightly as he watched her movements with a careful intensity, his stormy eyes never leaving hers, conveying more than words ever could. Emily adjusted the bandage once more, smoothing it carefully while noting the subtle changes in his expression, the faint easing of discomfort signaling that her efforts were effective, and she felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, tempered by the ever-present awareness that the empty stadium offered no help if anything shifted unexpectedly. She took a slow breath, scanning the vast rows of seats, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in long strips, and felt a shiver of awareness that even in the stillness, the space was not entirely devoid of threats or surprises. Lucas shifted again, this time signaling with a slight lift of his hand that he needed a small adjustment to the sling, and Emily responded immediately, sliding to his side with careful precision, her hands steady, her mind cataloging every movement as she ensured his comfort and stability. The air smelled faintly of concrete and cleaning solution, a reminder of the ordinary world pressing up against the extraordinary circumstances in which they were caught, and every measured step, every subtle adjustment, every careful motion carried a weight of responsibility she could not ignore. As she leaned slightly to check the tension on the fabric, she noticed a flicker of light from a far corner of the stadium, a reflection perhaps, and her pulse quickened, reminding her that awareness in this space meant constantly accounting for every shadow, every angle, every possibility. Lucas's gaze remained fixed on her, a silent reassurance that despite the vulnerabilities, the balance of power and trust had shifted subtly but firmly in her favor, the quiet acknowledgement in his eyes both grounding and motivating her as she continued her meticulous care. Her fingers moved with a practiced precision, adjusting straps, smoothing edges, ensuring that every detail contributed to stability and comfort, and she could feel a rhythm emerging, a dance of awareness and response that encapsulated the fragile trust between them. She stepped back just slightly to assess the results, Lucas's shoulders relaxing marginally, breathing deepening in controlled motions, and the bond formed through action, observation, and silent communication became tangible in the space between them, filling the void of the empty stadium with a charged, unspoken connection. Every ambient sound, the hum of the lights, the distant echoes from the upper tiers, the faint squeak of her shoes on the polished floor, merged with the rhythm of their interactions, creating a focus that was both precise and encompassing, where each small act of care reinforced the delicate balance of vulnerability, attention, and trust. Emily recognized that the night had shifted in subtle but irrevocable ways. The relationship between action and observation, trust and awareness, now forming a tightly held understanding that would define the hours ahead under the stark, indifferent glow of the stadium lights. And in that moment, every movement mattered, every glance was a communication, and every breath carried the weight of responsibility and connection between them. The faint hum of the stadium lights created a steady rhythm that matched the quickened pace of Emily Carter's thoughts as she moved carefully around Lucas Donovan, her eyes constantly scanning for anything out of place, anything that might disrupt the fragile calm they had established. The concrete under her feet was cold, and the echoes of their previous movements bounced softly across the empty tiers, a subtle reminder that they were alone but still exposed. She adjusted the sling once more, checking that his weight was properly supported and that every strap was snug without causing discomfort, and Lucas shifted slightly, the faintest hint of a sigh escaping him as he let her guide his arm with her steady hands. Emily could feel the tension in her own shoulders easing slightly, the focus of her attention narrowing to the small movements, the subtle cues that communicated his needs without a single word being spoken. The stadium smelled faintly of old leather and polished concrete, mixed with the lingering scent of cleaning supplies, and the contrast between the emptiness around them and the intensity of their shared focus made the space feel suspended, a private world of awareness and care. A distant clang from the upper concourse made her glance up reflexively, her pulse quickening for a heartbeat, and Lucas's eyes followed hers, a small nod signaling that he understood her vigilance and that the environment still required their full attention. She adjusted her grip on the sling again, running her fingers over the fabric to ensure there were no folds that could irritate his skin, and he allowed her movements, watching her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously supported and observed. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, the soft tap of her shoes on the concrete floor a subtle accompaniment to the careful adjustments she made, each motion reinforcing the trust and understanding that had developed between them. The shadows from the stadium seats stretched long across the floor, shifting as the flickering lights above cast their uneven glow, and Emily felt the quiet tension in the air, the sense that every second mattered, that their focus and attention could not waver. She smoothed the fabric one final time, stepped back slightly, and watched Lucas flex his fingers gently in the sling, his expression softening just enough to indicate that her efforts were paying off, that the tension had eased enough to allow him a small measure of comfort. The rhythm of their breathing synchronized imperceptibly, a quiet dance of awareness and response that held them steady in the vast emptiness around them, and Emily felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation, knowing that the night was far from over, yet confident in the bond forged through shared vigilance and careful action. The empty stadium, once intimidating and cold, now felt like a space of connection, where each glance, each careful motion, and each silent acknowledgement carried weight, reinforcing the unspoken agreement that they were present for one another, grounded in a balance of trust, attention, and quiet courage. As she adjusted the last strap, her green eyes met his stormy gaze, and in that shared look, there was a recognition of effort, of reliance, and of a connection forged under the stark lights of the empty stadium, where silence was not emptiness, but the space for understanding and mutual care to grow. Emily Carter took a cautious step back, scanning the expanse of the stadium once more, the echo of her own shoes against the polished concrete blending with the distant hum of the overhead lights, creating a rhythm that mirrored the careful control she maintained over her movements. Lucas Donovan shifted slightly, his stormy gaze following her with an intensity that seemed to measure every adjustment she made, every careful breath, every motion of her hands as she ensured the sling remained secure and comfortable. The air smelled faintly of old leather, concrete, and the cleaning solution she had used, a mixture that grounded her as she moved deliberately around him, her focus unbroken by the vast emptiness surrounding them. A soft scrape echoed from the upper tiers, causing her to pause, eyes narrowing as she scanned for the source, and Lucas's subtle nod encouraged her, silently affirming her attention without the need for words, the quiet communication between them a tether of trust and mutual awareness. She smoothed the fabric once more, checking that it did not rub uncomfortably against his skin, noting the slight relaxation in his shoulders as he allowed her guidance, and a sense of measured control settled over her, the responsibility of the moment heightening her focus rather than overwhelming it. The stadium seats stretched endlessly into shadow, the polished concrete reflecting the flickering lights above, yet within this space, a sphere of concentration formed around them, isolating the interaction from the emptiness and imbuing it with a sense of intensity and intimacy that neither the shadows nor the distance could diminish. Emily adjusted the strap carefully, ensuring it would support his weight without causing strain, and as she did, she noted the small exhalation of relief from Lucas, a quiet acknowledgement of her care, reinforcing the silent rhythm that had developed between them. Every subtle movement, the tilt of his hand, the shift of his torso, the rise and fall of his chest, became a guide, and she responded with precision, aware that each gesture, each adjustment, carried weight and meaning, reinforcing the delicate trust between them. The hum of the stadium, punctuated by distant creaks and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the far reaches, underscored the importance of attentiveness, each echo a reminder that in this vast space, concentration and vigilance were paramount. Emily's green eyes met his stormy gaze again, the unspoken understanding between them solidifying, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of vulnerability and authority had shifted subtly but unmistakably in her favor. She stepped slightly closer, smoothing the last folds of the sling and adjusting his position to ensure he remained supported, noting the faint relaxation in his jaw and shoulders, the steadying of his breathing, and the subtle nod he offered, communicating more than words ever could. The expansive stadium, once an intimidating void, now felt charged with their connection, every detail. The echo of footsteps, the reflection of lights on the concrete, the faint scent in the air, heightening the shared focus, reinforcing the careful, deliberate care Emily provided, and solidifying the bond of trust and quiet confidence that had formed between them in the stillness of the night. Emily Carter paused for a brief moment, listening to the subtle shifts in the stadium, the soft hum of the lights above blending with the faint echoes from distant corners, each sound sharpening her awareness as she adjusted her stance beside Lucas Donovan. The vast emptiness of the arena stretched around them, yet the space between them pulsed with a quiet intensity, every glance, every movement charged with attention and purpose. Lucas shifted slightly, the slight tension in his shoulders easing as Emily smoothed the sling one last time. The faint exhale that escaped him a signal of trust and acknowledgement, a wordless communication that anchored her focus. She checked the straps again, ensuring the fabric was taut, enough to support his weight without causing discomfort, her fingers brushing lightly over the textured cloth, the subtle motions guided by instinct and training, while her green eyes caught the faintest flicker of light from the upper concourse, a reminder that vigilance was constant even in the stillness. The concrete beneath her knees was cold, the subtle scent of cleaning supplies mingling with the faint odor of aged leather and polished floors, grounding her as she maintained careful control of the moment, every movement deliberate, precise, and attentive. Lucas's gaze followed her, stormy yet composed, a quiet presence that simultaneously demanded attention and offered reassurance, each slight tilt of his head a cue, each measured blink a silent acknowledgement. Emily adjusted her grip on the sling again, pressing the fabric into place and testing its tension, making minute corrections as he shifted slightly in response, the rhythm of their actions forming an unspoken coordination that seemed to suspend time within the vast, empty stadium. The soft echo of footsteps above caused a flicker of tension, her ears attuned to the sound, and Lucas's subtle glance reassured her that the surrounding environment required constant awareness, yet within their shared focus, calm and measured care could prevail. She smoothed the edges of the sling, making certain that every fold, every contour, was optimized for support and comfort, and as she observed the gradual relaxation of his posture, a sense of accomplishment mingled with the vigilance that still demanded her attention. The interplay of shadows cast by the high beams above created subtle patterns across the concrete floor and the rows of seats, highlighting the expanse of emptiness while framing the intimate space they occupied together, a contrast that heightened the intensity of each movement and glance. Every breath, every adjustment, every small gesture reinforced the trust that had been carefully established, the delicate balance of care and observation that connected them in the quiet stillness of the night. Emily stepped slightly to the side, hands poised to respond, eyes following the subtle movements of his shoulders and arms, noting the steady deepening of his breathing, and in that moment, The enormity of the empty stadium faded into the background, leaving only the focused, deliberate connection between them, a shared awareness, and a growing bond built on attention, trust, and the quiet courage to act with precision and care under the stark fluorescent glow of the arena lights. Emily Carter felt a subtle shift in the air, a quiet tension that signaled the night was entering a new phase, the vast stadium around them echoing with emptiness yet alive with the resonance of their shared focus. She adjusted her hands on the sling one last time, ensuring every strap was smooth and supportive, and Lucas Donovan shifted slightly to indicate a small change in comfort, his stormy eyes meeting hers in a silent exchange that carried more meaning than any words could convey. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, reflecting in the polished surfaces and the empty rows of seats, framing the space as both vast and intimate at once. Emily took a slow breath, letting the calm determination steady her nerves, and noted the subtle easing of tension in his jaw and shoulders, the faint exhale that seemed to communicate trust and acknowledgement. Every movement she made, each careful adjustment to the sling, every glance toward him was measured, deliberate, forming an intricate rhythm of care and attention that held them both steady in the stillness. She could feel the pulse of the stadium around them, the distant hum of the lights blending with the soft scrape of her shoes against the floor and the gentle shift of Lucas in response, creating a synchronization of presence and awareness that made the space feel charged yet controlled. Lucas's gaze remained fixed on her, stormy yet appreciative, a silent assurance that he understood and accepted her guidance, and the subtle nod of his head reinforced the unspoken agreement that each action mattered, each careful step was vital, and the connection between them was real and immediate. Emily smoothed the edges of the fabric once more, the texture under her fingertips grounding her. In the moment, and she observed the faint relaxation in his posture, the deepening of his breath, the subtle shifts that signaled relief, and she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment mingled with heightened vigilance. The empty stadium seats stretched endlessly into shadow, the polished concrete reflecting the dim glow above. Yet within this expanse, a private sphere of interaction had formed, a bubble of focus, trust, and careful attention where the outside world ceased to exist and only the present moment mattered. Emily adjusted her stance slightly, poised to respond, her green eyes following the faintest movements of his body, noting the rhythm of his breathing, the slight flex of his fingers, the alignment of his shoulders, all cues to guide her next motion. The subtle interplay of shadows and light, the distant echoes, and the muted ambient sounds emphasized the weight of silence, each element contributing to the intensity of the moment, and Emily felt the full measure of responsibility for his well-being resting in her hands. As she stepped back to survey the results of her careful attention, Lucas's gaze held hers, and in that shared look there was an unspoken acknowledgement of trust, understanding, and connection, a recognition that the events of the night had forged a bond of attention, reliance, and quiet courage that would endure beyond the emptiness of the stadium and the flickering lights above them. The rhythm of their interaction continued, each breath, glance, and subtle gesture reinforcing the careful balance of care and vigilance, and Emily realized that the trust between them had become a tangible presence, filling the space with a quiet intensity that transformed the night, the stadium, and the stillness into a living testament to the connection they had built through deliberate, mindful action and unwavering focus. The stadium remained suspended in silence, the faint hum of the lights above the empty seats creating a steady rhythm as Emily Carter stood slightly apart from Lucas Donovan, her green eyes still scanning him for any sign of discomfort, any indication that her care had fallen short. Every motion, every careful adjustment of the sling and fabric had been precise, deliberate, and she could see the subtle relaxation in his posture, the deepening of his breaths as he settled into the support she had provided. Yet the intensity in his stormy gaze had not diminished, holding her attention with the quiet gravity of unspoken acknowledgement. The cold concrete under her feet, the faint lingering odor of cleaning supplies and polished surfaces, and the distant echoes from the upper tiers formed a backdrop that made the intimacy of their connection even more pronounced, the space between them charged with quiet focus and measured trust. She adjusted the strap one last time, testing the tension with careful hands, and Lucas shifted slightly to accommodate her movements, allowing her to maintain control without a word. His acknowledgement conveyed entirely through subtle cues, a tilt of his head, a soft exhale, the precise movement of his shoulders. The stadium lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor and empty rows of seats, highlighting the contrast between the vast emptiness around them and the concentrated intensity in the small area where they were connected by attention and deliberate care. Emily stepped closer, hands hovering, ready to adjust or respond to any signal he gave, and Lucas's gaze met hers with a weight that spoke of trust, recognition, and a deep, unspoken understanding that each careful act mattered, that the bond between them had been forged in precision, focus, and the shared responsibility of the moment. The faint echo of distant sounds, the scrape of a chair, the soft hum of machinery somewhere in the concourse, the whisper of air moving through ventilation, reminded her of the stillness and the importance of awareness, each minor detail contributing to the shared rhythm that had formed between them. Emily's movements were methodical, smoothing fabric, adjusting the sling, observing his posture, breathing, and subtle expressions, each action reinforcing the unspoken communication and the trust that had developed over the course of the night. The quiet understanding that she had the ability to provide care and support, and he had the ability to respond, guide, and acknowledge. The empty seats and polished floors reflected the harsh fluorescent light, creating long mirrored strips that seemed to stretch into infinity, yet the focus of the night was contained entirely in the careful, deliberate interaction between them, where attention, vigilance, and subtle gestures created an unbroken line of connection and understanding. As Emily took a measured step back, hands poised, eyes locked on his movements, she could feel the full weight of responsibility that had been shared and accepted, the quiet trust that existed in their synchronization, and the stadium, once intimidating and empty, now felt transformed into a space where focus, care, and mutual understanding had created a bond, tangible and enduring, solidified under the glow of the lights and in the quiet of the night, a connection built on observation, deliberate action, and the unwavering presence of each in the other's awareness.